Welcome to PAATH History. Today we are going to discuss about Indian feudalism. The concept of Indian feudalism, doubtless the most controversial of modern Indian historiography, is of relatively recent origin. D.N. Jha and Irfan Habib have shown that the discussion on Indian feudalism began with the heated and protracted Marxist debate on Marx's concept of the Asiatic mode of production, or AMP. The understandable dislike of Indian Marxist historians of the notion of the unchangeableness of Asiatic societies and of Oriental despotism, both derived from the concept of AMP, led to the theoretical emancipation of Indian Marxist historians from Marx's loosely knit construct of the AMP and to an acceptance of the Marxist periodization of European and world history as a hypothesis for the analysis of the historical evidence. Marxist historians who have made the main contribution to the study of Indian feudalism tend to neglect contradicting evidence. Non-Marxist historians usually abhor the idea that some aspects or even periods of Indian social and state formation may depict traces of feudalism. D.D. Kosambi published 2 articles on the development of feudalism in India and Kashmir in 1956. Moreover, in the same year appeared Kosambi's famous An Introduction to the Study of Indian History. Its 2 separate chapters on feudalism from above and feudalism from below may be regarded as the first conceptual definition of Indian feudalism. Only 2 years after Kosambi's contribution to the concept of Indian feudalism, R.S. Sharma began to publish articles on the origin and development of feudalism in India. In 1965, these articles, enlarged and supplemented by new studies, came out in his book entitled Indian Feudalism, which became the standard work on Indian feudalism and as much the focal point of an ongoing debate which continues. According to Sharma, a major cause of feudalism in India was the ever-increasing number of land grants to Brahmins, religious institutions. The land grants are called agrahar since the early centuries CE and later also to government officials. Their endowment with more and more immunities or parihara, for example freedom from taxation and from inspection by royal officers, or achato bhato praveshya, and with royal prerogatives, for example jurisdiction and collection of fines, led to the emergence of a class of landed intermediaries. Jagovalko laid down that land should be assigned to the cultivators by the landowner or Kshetraswami and not by the king or Mohipati. From the reference from Smriti, Sharma pointed out that there were 4 hierarchical stages comprising Mohipati, Kshetraswami or Swami, Karshaka or cultivator, and the subtenant or hired labor. Sharma was not certain about the last stage during the Gupta period. There can be no doubt about the existence of the first 3. Sharma was sure about the new intermediaries. They encroached on communal village land and slowly reduced villagers to serfdom. This development was partly caused and further aggravated by a decline of urbanism and inter-regional, particularly international trade, and as a result of this decline, there was a paucity of coins in the post-Gupta period. Sharma called it monetary anemia. In a separate work named urban decay in India, Sharma discussed about the decline of urban centers. Politically, these developments were characterized by a continuous process of fragmentation and decentralization caused by the widespread practice of granting big and small territories to vassals and officials who entrenched themselves territorially and ended up as independent potentates. In the discussion about the Chola state in the context of South India, N. Karashima noticed statements about individual ownership of land instead of the ownership of the Ur. A few months before the publication of his magnum opus, R. S. Sharma conducted a special symposium at the Center of Advanced Study in Ancient Indian History and Culture at the University of Calcutta. During this seminar, Sharma's theories were thoroughly discussed. They met with a fairly wide consensus among the participants, but also with some contradictions, and evoked D.C. Sircar's famous verdict against Indian feudalism. In a paper entitled Landlordism Confused with Feudalism, Sircar postulated that feudalism is a misnomer in the early Indian context. Sircar's main argument against the applicability of any concept of feudalism to early medieval India is the undeniable scarcity of evidence for service tenure against the overwhelming majority of land grants to Brahmins and religious institutions. The majority of the numerous charters discovered all over the country record grants of land to gods and Brahmins without stipulating any obligation of the donis to the donors. Obviously, the priestly class was the most unsuitable for rendering services of the feudal type. In the narrow context of the European model of early feudalism, this argument is certainly correct. But as has been shown elsewhere by Hermann Kulke, in early medieval India, Brahmins often fulfilled exactly this role, though with means different from their contemporary feudal counterparts in Merovingian and Carolingian Europe. The discussion gathered momentum again in the early 70s. A strong impetus came from B.N.S. Yadava's study of northern India during the 12th century. In many ways, it is a consequent and consistent follow-up of Sharma's study. In 1979 and 1980, the issue of Indian feudalism suddenly stood in the limelight of a large audience when 3 presidential addresses of the Indian History Congress were delivered on this subject. At the 40th session of the Indian History Congress at Voltaire University in December 1979, D. N. Jha read Early Indian Feudalism, a historiographical critique in the section of Ancient India. Hermann Mukhia addressed the section on medieval India with a controversial paper, Was There Feudalism in Indian History? At the 41st session of the Indian History Congress in Bombay, V.N.S. Yadava delivered yet another presidential address in the section of Ancient India, this one on the problem of the emergence of feudal relations in early India. During these years, clearly Indian feudalism had become the major issue in early India's historiography. After having again refuted Marx's concept of the Asiatic mode of production, Jha fully supported in his address the Marxist concept of Indian feudalism. In his presidential address of 1980, Yadav adopted a more critical tone when he stated that the study of Indian feudalism has yet to achieve greater theoretical sophistication in historical analysis. He based his argument primarily on the evidence from late classical and early medieval literary sources, for example, early treatises on horoscopy of the Jyotisha Shastra and Dharma Shastras and their commentaries, which have undoubtedly the potentiality of providing additional bits of evidence for the subjection of peasants by landlords through non-economic coercion. But even though he tried to present new evidence on the subjection of peasantry, forced labor, and restriction on mobility, he admitted that the feudal mode of production was not as strong in India as in medieval Europe, because in India it is found to have been interlocked and to have coexisted with non-feudal elements. With regard to the feudal nature of India's political structure, however, he observed in essence a marked resemblance to that of Western European feudalism. Whereas D.N. Jha and V.N.S. Yadav in their respective presidential addresses had tried to reconcile the notion of Indian feudalism with Marxist and European concept, even more than R.S. Sharma, in 1979, Hermann Mukhia questioned the very existence of this alleged Indian feudalism. After a thorough analysis of various notions of European feudalism, Mukhia points out that European feudalism emerged from changes at the base of society, whereas in India, the establishment of feudalism is attributed by its protagonists primarily to state actions in granting land. It is indeed a moot point whether such complex social structures as feudalism can be established through administrative and legal procedures. Mukhia also questions several other essentials in the concept of Indian feudalism. Where Sharma and Yadava noticed the peasantry's dependence, he perceives increasing exploitation and points out that forced labor in India was in its essence an incidental manifestation of the ruling class's political and administrative power rather than a part of the process of production. Similarly, he doubts that serfdom was a dominant feature in medieval India. Another important point of Mukhia's argument is his statement that the high fertility of India's soil permitted the Indian peasant to subsist at a much lower level of resources than his European counterpart. In 1985, after several years of intensive preparation, a special issue of the Journal of Peasant Society on Feudalism and Non-European Societies was edited by T.J. Byres and H. Mukhia. Here, a number of renowned scholars came forward with critical evaluations of Mukhia's thesis in the context of Asian history. R.S. Sharma, Irfan Habib, Barton Stein, and Frank Perlin's papers pertain to India, as does Mukhia's response to his critics. Through the publication of this volume and its contributions, the question of an Indian feudalism was for the first time taken up at an international level. In his contribution, How Feudal Was Indian Feudalism, R.S. Sharma enters a spirited and eloquent defense of the feudalism notion in orthodox Marxist terms, as Byres says in his introduction. Sharma's paper may have to be regarded as the final comprehensive interpretation of the prevailing concept of Indian feudalism. Although this concept has been modified in details by the contributions mentioned here, it is still primarily based on Sharma's notion as described in his book Indian Feudalism. In response to his critics, Mukhia admits that Sharma's article marks a search for a genuinely Indian variant of feudalism, but he says that Sharma's model still does not take sufficient notice of the considerable technological and economic growth in the early medieval period. Moreover, it does not provide any help on how to characterize the 5 or 6 centuries between the decline of feudalism and the beginning of Indian colonization. A sad comment on the lack of rigor in the concept of Indian feudalism. The latest comprehensive publications on the Indian feudalism are a compilation of articles of the Indian Feudalism School edited by D.N. Jha and V.K. Thakur's Historiography of Indian Feudalism. In the same way as Sharma's article of 1985 contains a comprehensive depiction of his notion of Indian feudalism, Jha's anthology gives a fairly impressive account of the various feudalism studies which meanwhile have been taken up by the Indian Feudalism School and its adherents. However, it does not contain any new attempts to reassess the concept in view of Mukhia's challenge. Thakur's Historiography of Indian Feudalism too is a rather orthodox attempt to reject Mukhia's thesis and its faulty premise of the absence of a dependent peasantry, as well as B.D. Chattopadhyaya's findings on a continuation of urbanization and trade in early medieval India. Most recently, Chattopadhyaya, in his book The Making of Early Medieval India, observes an inflation of the concept and complains that the construct of Indian feudalism has begun to acquire a stereotyped image, particularly in its failure to accommodate long-term dynamics of change in Indian history. Some historians rejected the theory of urban decay, decline of trade, and monetary anemia in the early medieval India. Ranabir Chakraborty argues that there were some local trade centers both in North and South India. Examples are Hatta, Hottika, Mandapika, etc. B.N. Mukherjee, in his article Commerce and Money in Western and Central Sectors of Eastern India, and in his book Media of Exchange in Early Medieval North India, opposed the theory of monetary anemia. B.D. Chattopadhyaya, in his famous work The Making of Early Medieval India, criticized the theory of urban decay. He coined the term third urbanization in the context of the early medieval Indian history. R. Champakalaxmi, in the famous work Trade, Ideology and Urbanization, discussed about the urbanization in South India and related the process with trade and religion. In his recent work named Early Medieval Indian Society, R.S. Sharma related the feudal model with the changing nature of the culture and the society and discussed about the tantric cult and bhakti movement in that context. He discovered feudal mind. Another important model relating to the early medieval polity is the model of segmentary model by Bartenstein in the context of South India. But this model was also questioned by some scholars including R.S. Sharma. Hermann Kulke used the term Samantization in that context and found the presence of an integrative polity. The debate is endless and the scholars are involved in it. Some scholars like R. Champakalaxmi, K. Veluthot are working with the South Indian context also. So the debates are running and the scholars are working hard to reconstruct the history. This is the end of our today's discussion. Subscribe our channel, like our video and comment. Listen to our podcast episode. Follow our official Facebook page, Twitter handle and Instagram. For any query, feel free to mail us. For details, see the description.